I would like to introduce everyone to Annie, who is the speaker of today's book discussion. She has written various poetry, essays, fiction, and she's the author of Known Tough, Bantering with Bandits and Other True Tales, a collection of essays shortlisted for the Vodafone Cross Book Award in a nonfiction category in 2011. She's also the co-author of The Bad Boys Guide to the Good Indian Girl, the series of illustrated poems. Crush was made in collaboration with artist Ginelle Elvis, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and a collection of short love stories 1 to 14 were published in 2012. And her work has appeared in various anthologies, including Mumbai Noir, Women Changing India, India Shining, India Changing, and literary journals like Pratilipi. And she won the Hindu Playwright Award in 2018 for her play Untitled One and 9 Dots Prize in 2019 for her essay Bread, Cement, and Cactus. Her novel Prelude to a Rite won a Tata Literature Live Award of the year in the year 2020. Now I'd like to introduce our chair, Wafa Hamid, who was my classmate in graduation, and she was one of the most brilliant students in our classes. And she's an assistant professor at Lady Shri Ram College. She has taught several courses in English language and literature at the postgraduate and undergraduate level. She was awarded her PhD in 2020, or 21.
I submitted in 2020, but the award happened. It's all right. I mean, there's PhD anyways.
Still an assistant professor, that matters more. Our areas of interest include gender and sexuality studies, literary theory, popular culture, women writing, culture studies, South Asian studies, and translation studies, among others. Her most recent publication includes a study of Kashmiri American poet Agha Shahid Ali, with focus on the poetics of Kashmir. So now I hand over the session to you, Wafa. You can take over from here.
Thank you so much, Shiba, and thank you for the Center for Study of Cultural or Plural Societies for organizing this. And of course, thank you to our speaker. And we'll in the session, just to give a basic outline for the proceedings for the afternoon, we'll start with the author Annie Zaidi talking about her most recent work, The City of Incident. And we'll sort of move on for that after a half an hour, 40 minutes of conversation and hopefully sections that you would like to read from the text. Then sort of I'll have a little bit of intervention and discussion with her around her work, some themes and so on and so forth. And we'll open the floor for questions where you can post, the audience can post the questions on chat if that's what they prefer, or they can just raise their hands, and either way we can sort of take questions. So over to you, Annie, and we're sort of looking forward to hearing you. Thank you.
Hello, hi Wafa. Thank you for the introduction, Shiba, and thank you CSPS for asking me to do this. I'm very happy to be meeting everyone and discussing this. How should we do this? Would you like me to do a little reading? Would you like me to just begin by introducing the book itself?
Why don't you start with like a little bit of a reading from any section that you'd prefer and talk about it. And if you'd like to have a conversation, I can start as a conversation as well. Whatever works for you. But a little excerpt from the book would sort of be wonderful.
Okay. So let me pick out one short passage, just a couple of minutes to give you a flavor of what kind of book this is. So this book is kind of organized in, I call it a novel in 12 parts, because what I'm doing here is each of the chapters is one story told from the perspective of or told about one character, and these characters do appear, but they don't get to have a voice in other people's stories. They only get to kind of introduce the reader to their own life in that sense. Even though they're not written in the first person, it's kind of understood that this is about them. I'm going to read from this chapter called A Woman Encounters Love in Illicit Places and Watches Over Her Lover's Wife. This is about a woman who lives in a high rise and reasonably well-to-do, and is having an affair with someone else. And I'll begin with the first couple of pages. This one is a smiling harump of a woman and has photos that prove it. She displays her rosy gums, does not press her lips together when the camera is pointed at her. There are hundreds of photos, sitting with mama, standing with papa, all of them clustered on the sofa at festivals, with her husband and children and in-laws, and with each of them separately. She has photos with friends from kindergarten, from college, with neighbors from every building she has ever lived in. Everyone has a memory of her rushing into the frame, saying, "Hold on, me too, take one with me too." Her friends would tilt their heads at pretty 15-degree angles to mask their chins. Not she. She tipped her head back and put her large teeth on show. Her husband teases her about her feral smile. As if you're going to eat the photographer the minute after he takes the photo. What are you so happy about, So much smiling, for what? She blinked when he said it. Her smile was slinking away, but she clenched it between her large teeth, and up she came again, bubbling with mirth. "You wait and see how I eat you." She said it with a laugh. She can say anything to anyone with that smile on her face. Ask anyone. They all say, "Such a lovely person, always smiling." But really, why does she do it? Smile all the time. Ask, and she will blink. Blink, blink. Press her for an answer. She's likely to say that she's busy enjoying life. She might chuck you under the chin. Smile more, think less. So much thinking, for what? This is her motto, she claims. Don't think too much, just do whatever you want. The truth is, she thinks a lot herself. Very hard, very fast. Like the time she took the last train home with her kitty group. She had to think about whether crossing the street to look for a taxi was a better option than taking the flyover. They were a group of 5 women and wouldn't fit into one taxi. 2 taxis would have to be found. Besides, it was a nice short walk home. Short walk home. True, there were all kinds of men and stray dogs just outside the railway station, but they could take the skywalk. It was quieter, safer, and it took them right down to the bus stop from where it was just half a kilometer to the apartment complex. In less than 10 seconds, she had made up her mind and then taken a left turn on the bridge that led towards the skywalk.
I wanted to talk first and foremost about, and I'll take this, I think, in parts, because I think this is a city novel. The city is very much present in the book in terms of, and also especially a city which has sort of a tension which is a constant in it. One in terms of this place for supposed aspirations and opportunities and so on and so forth, but also the claustrophobia of the city, the denseness of the city, and the whole idea of the unlivability of modern cities, whether it's Bombay or Delhi or wherever you go to. And I think how the city spaces itself. You've looked at largely the public and the domestic very interestingly, because you're looking at local trains and streets, and as well as the home and the domestic, which I'll come to in a bit. But could you talk a little more about the city as such? I mean, I don't know if it's a love letter or a love-hate relationship that most of us have with the city, and how the novel in particular sort of explores that, where the city is constant. It's a narrative of the city in ways. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Wafa. Yes, it's true. Actually, it is actually a love letter to the city. I think good love letters are also honest. They're not all key. Hi, how beautiful you are. It's also about expressing how you feel about the city. So in that sense, it is a love letter to Mumbai particularly. I have lived in Delhi too. I don't have such a long relationship with that city. I have complex feelings about it, but with Mumbai much more, because that's where I've lived longest now in my life. Not there right now, but that it is the city where I've spent like close to 16 years. And with the city, I do think with any city really, but with very large cities in particular, like you said, there is claustrophobia. Space is always at a premium in any large city. And I think this is true not just of India, all over the world. I mean, you hear really horrific stories about how much there is a space shortage in cities like, for example, Hong Kong or Seoul or Tokyo, and how people live in like literal matchbox sized kind of places where I mean, you're having to rearrange space all the time, that if you want to sleep, the same space has to function as everything else. It has to be your kitchen, it has to be a bedroom. The bedroom is created anew every day. You roll out a mattress, it becomes a bedroom. You roll up the mattress, it becomes a living room. And there is no choice but to live like this. And so there are pockets in Mumbai that you've seen this happen. I've seen it happen in Delhi too. And what I feel is that despite all of this, true claustrophobia comes from bad relationships. Nothing can make a space ugly in the way that a lack of freedom can, a lack of psychological or physical freedom. I mean, despite all the problems of Mumbai, I have a more positive relationship, I think, with it, because I am freer in the city. And I don't think even money has that much to do with it, because I don't have that much. We have lots of problems, physical, environmental problems, problems of flooding, for example. But I have never had the problem of having to explain to someone or having to obey someone when they tell me don't go out or don't do this or whatever. And I think that is a particular claustrophobia which can happen in any space. It can happen in villages, it can happen in small towns, it can happen in big cities. It does happen in big cities. Sometimes you just are deeply unhappy, and that unhappiness is its own kind of claustrophobia. You don't know how to snap out of that unhappiness. You feel like all the roads are converging onto this one road, and you don't have the option of taking any road but this, which is more a psychological state. It's never actually true in real life. So there is, I was not consciously perhaps, but unconsciously trying to tap into these different kinds of claustrophobia. I would meet people and they seem to have money, more money than, for example, a beggar on the street that obviously has nothing. But you'd see that despite the lack of choices in life, is able to psychologically lift himself or herself above that deficiency. But you'd also see, I found this more true for housewives, but maybe it's true for other people also, men in particular states of mind, where they'd be deeply unhappy, even though they do have that. In Mumbai, a flat of your own is like this dream, it's the great middle class dream, having your own place. And they'd have that and they'd have a job, but the unhappiness and that sense of claustrophobia would not leave them. And I think that comes from the kind of life you lead, really. So I think I was playing with that in a lot of these stories.
It's interesting you mentioned the housewife, and I think even with the experience of the city, I think even the pandemic has drastically changed in ways our experience of the city, and more than anything else, our experience of home. And your narrative, I mean, the novel, short stories, whatever, I mean, in terms of the middle genre that it's working around, looks at 6 men, but also 6 women. And a lot of these women experience home very differently. For example, in the story that you read, there's this entire existence of boredom while you're at home, and you don't know what to do with yourself. And this who lays claim, in fact, to the home, who has what kind of claims to the home. There's another story where you talk about a woman who works and she's not allowed to leave work till she has children. And so, I mean, I'm also really interested in terms of the city, but also the idea of home and homing, and within the home, the uncanniness of not having a space, which traditionally, I mean, domestic spaces seen to be or talked about as women's spaces, but it's not really the case. So, I mean, just a little bit on that aspect of the 6 women and talking about their fraught relationship with the home in the city.
Yeah, actually, now that you mention it, it's true that in this book, I don't think I did this deliberately, but it's true that all of them have home problems, the women particularly. Some want to stay home but can't. Some can't leave the home when they want to, and some have invited trouble into their home and they don't know what to do with it. And some just don't have the home. Like there's one whose home is demolished by the municipality. So and all these characters are obviously all around us in some ways. With women, I think particularly because children come into the picture, and because of the possibility of children, everybody also builds this expectation around them about how their lives will be. If you have children, the expectation is that the children become a priority. But if there are no children, you aren't really allowed to just be, you know. Your life has to become valuable. And I think for men also this is true, that you have to justify your existence somehow, even to your own families, that kuch kar nahi rahe hain, you know, like kya kar rahe ho? What are you doing with your life? And that doing is something that requires you to step outside of the house or at least earn money. And if you have a job, there is this great thing of just be grateful you have a job, you know, at least you're not sitting at home uselessly. So this sense of being useful, and I think for men it comes mainly from jobs, being able to provide and so on, look after your family. For women, the sense of usefulness also comes from their bodies. In that sense, their bodies are the original home for all of humanity. And if the body fails, it does dislocate you as a person in some way. If you don't have children, or if you want children but can't have them, this sense of what to do with this body, you know, it's never going to be a home, or not very easily going to be a home for anybody. And if it isn't, then are you allowed to live at home in the way you would like? Does anyone even understand what it's doing to you psychologically? These are some of the things I was thinking about. And I don't think people understand very easily the sense of the tormented relationship a lot of women have with home, with just the sense of 4 walls, with going somewhere, being allowed to go somewhere, constantly having to report back to someone about where you're going, who is coming home in your husband's absence, who is coming home. These are also questions, you know, that who's watching you, who's reporting to whom about you, what will that do to your relationships? Like in one of the stories, this woman, she doesn't want much. She's okay, you know, but she needs something outside of her family. And it is something as small as that. I think for about 90% of women in this country, you cannot tell or explain to your family that you need something outside the family, that you need a life outside the family, that this is not enough. No matter how loving they are, I mean, your husband can be faithful to you, your kids are gorgeous, you love them, obviously, but you need something outside. And why is this so difficult to understand? But it is. And you just drive yourself mad, or you drive your relationships into a corner, kind of, because you don't know how to explain this and nobody understands it. So I wanted to explore that a little bit.
Also, I wanted to just read one line from this second story. And I think it's sort of brilliant in the way it starts, because it sort of embodies a lot of the issues that a lot of us face, and otherwise as well the experience of the city, which is the second story. The sales girl rides the footboard forgetting the price of love, where you start with saying this woman is so transparent. The evil eye cannot fall upon her. Perhaps the evil goes right through her body, falling on the person standing right behind her in queue for the renewal of a second-class pass. And I find that very striking in terms of the visibility and invisibility of bodies within the city, where the city is like a felt experience. There's an odor of a city, there are tastes of the city, there are noises or an oral experience of the city. And I think your novel explores that in sort of multiple ways, where there are, I think it's also, apart from the written text, it's sort of a string of images that I thought were very striking, whether it's the footboard that people stand on in the local or anything else. So I'm also interested in, or women who smile and smile all the time. And why do they smile? So I was also wondering in terms of how the text especially looks at, how the novel looks at how people experience the city in terms of their bodies, where their bodies become narratives of the city, of whether they're visible or invisible. And especially in this text, this second story, I think it's an invisibilized body that tries to become visible. And even the one that you talked about, where the home is bulldozed over. So I find that also very interesting in terms of the kind of characters you're looking at. And they weave a certain kind of story of the city, which is not necessarily one which you see in all cinema or all film or other kinds of representations of a city. And sort of what sort of made you write those bodies within the city, where the public space works very differently and is felt very differently through these bodies.
Yeah, I think in a city like Bombay, increasingly in Delhi too, I think, but especially in Mumbai, I felt that you can't escape the materiality of other people. You know, it's just so in your face. Mostly half the time, like your nose is in someone's armpit or somebody's elbow is on your side. So, I mean, you can't escape the physicality of other people around you. The bodies are just right in your face like that. But I think a lot of this has to do with me traveling in Mumbai's local trains, particularly, and also the women's compartment in particular. And for anybody who's done this, I'm sure even now, even the Delhi Metro has a women's compartment. So I'm sure even you have that experience where women's bodies behave in different ways in mixed surroundings and in women-only surroundings. They look at each other in different ways in women-only surroundings. They suddenly become people. And I have had this experience over and over in women-only spaces, whether it's in colleges or whatever. When you're only amongst other women, your femininity does not need to be, it's neither being, in some ways, nobody's trying to extract it from you or extract something from you in that sense, physically. You become free to just be. Like, you see women really enjoying their bodies. You see them putting makeup on. Even in Delhi, I've seen it. Like, when there are no men watching, the girls will bring out the makeup out of the handbags and start, that, in a sense, making themselves up to face the world. And I remember seeing a lot of young girls who were clearly upwardly mobile, in the sense that I could tell, partly from observing them, that they're not necessarily working in very high-paying jobs, that very often they are leading very, very kind of fragile lives in that sense. But they had a certain confidence and they wanted to dress differently. They'd put on all these like the latest kind of jewelry, whatever was most in fashion, and jewelry was often sold in the Bombay trains. A vendor would jump into the train and he'd bring this huge kind of like this lattice work of jewelry and present it to you, and all the girls would get involved with looking at it. And I thought about characters like that in the city, that, sometimes, especially because in Bombay, this is true more of Bombay than anywhere else, because there is a first class and a second class, and you saw the divide so sharply. So there were second class bodies and there were first class bodies. And I was really fascinated by it. And if you're traveling in the first class, I often did, I've traveled in both places, but if you're traveling in the first class, there was this huge suspicion of the moment you create a space where you say, this is for these people only, people of this class, people who have first class tickets, people who look like they could belong in first class. Now, if there's a ticket checker, okay, if for example, like in the modern metro systems, you just put your card on the machine and the machine decides whether or not you can go in, it's a different matter. But if you can't, if you are, for example, just boarding a train, now the question for you as a citizen is, the person you're looking at, do they belong here or not? You can choose not to have that question in your mind at all. Everybody belongs here. But the moment you create this division, first class, second class, third class, the question will present itself, right? Does this person belong here? And the moment that happens, the moment that question becomes apparent that this person may not belong here, then what about her looks like it doesn't belong? Is it her jewelry? Is it is it skin color? Is it that she's too dark? Is it that she's wearing a cheap sari? Is the expensive sari kind of your ticket in a way to travel in? And I saw this all the time. People were constantly judging each other, sometimes verbally out loud, sometimes not. So I was interested in that. What is it about the body of people that is making yourself decide that we belong, that person doesn't? How to reinvent your body so that, package it so that you actually begin to fit into a higher class? And what does that then mean for your prospects in life? How long before you actually legitimately belong to a higher class? And also with regard to people on the streets, I mean, their bodies are so vulnerable. It's very distressing. And I think it is the ultimate fear for all of us. Like in Hindi, we have this phrase, no, sarak pe aa jana. Sarak pe aa jana means nothing worse can happen to you, right? You've lost everything, and home is protection. To have something around you, whether it's a car or whether it's four walls, it's protection from the elements, but also from other people. To be on the street means to have nothing, no form of protection at all. And you see so many such people in large cities. And I would see them, particularly the women. You're always haunted by this feeling. Women, children, you see them always at railway stations. And obviously you have to wonder about what form of protection they have. And I often find that, particularly in the last 10 years, I would find people coming up and saying things like, you'd see that they knew migrants into the city. I mean, they were still wearing very rustic clothes, very distinctive clothes, you could tell that they've come in within the last 1 month or something. And they'd come up to you and they'd ask for money to go back home, saying that we've been here, something brought us here. Now, whether they actually want to go back home or not is a separate question. But they do come with their stories, whether they're inventing the story, whether they're burnishing the story. I mean, that question is not of interest to me. What is interesting is that they've come with nothing but their bodies, their clothes, possibly their labor. Maybe they tried to find jobs, maybe they couldn't, maybe they were looking for their children, maybe the children died. We don't know what happens to them. But here they are in this moment, and you have to recognize that moment and you have to respond to it. How are you going to respond to these people? Those are the questions that interested me.
Your response sort of takes me in two directions. One of them is just the very idea of belonging. And I think you've explored belonging and displacement across the body of your work. Whether it's looking at bread, cement, cactus, or it's looking at your poetry, or it's looking at your earlier work. and or a prelude to a riot, etc. And also death. I think even though, I mean, it doesn't come out explicitly as an important aspect of the novel, I think death is there as a constant through various images in the novel. And again, as all of us, my thoughts again go to the pandemic in terms of how city spaces more than anywhere else, a lot of us have experienced death, not just in one country, all over the world. However, when you look at a lot of the media, the narrative of death still seems to be a desirable narrative, where sort of on one hand, people say death has been an equalizer in the pandemic, but has it really? So I also wanted, I mean, could you talk a little more about the life in between death, where there is not necessarily a divide between the two, and they keep overlapping. And that's how sort of a lot of your narratives overlap as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I am sort of preoccupied by death for some reason. That is true. I do think, and I say this in Bread, Cement, Cactus too, that death is a way of belonging too. That death is who is allowed to die how, and how you're allowed to remember people after they die is a big part of whether or not you belong, whether or not somebody will allow you to belong. With regard to the media, and I've worked as a journalist, so I know how it works. It's a little unsavory, but the fact of the matter is that nobody is interested in normalcy very much in terms of news, right? Normalcy is never news. Normalcy is a happy place, and that occasionally we don't mind being happy. But I think by and large, we want to know about what happened. You know, the reason I call it a city of incident is that it is only when something happens that is seen to be in some way out of the ordinary, worth remarking on, something that shouldn't have happened has happened. I mean, if an old person dies in bed surrounded by their family, that is not considered an incident. A young woman dying somewhere in an accident is considered an incident. Somebody falling, somebody's home being destroyed, whether in a natural disaster or in some other fashion, the bulldozers being sent, that is an incident. A child falling sick, that is an incident. Those are the kind of things that I'm dealing with really, and partly because this is human nature. I mean, we can blame the media, but the truth is that we ourselves are drawn to what is out of the ordinary, a death which is out of the ordinary, and be curious, what made that happen? News builds on that curiosity. What a woman fell to her death. Did she fall? Did she jump? We don't know. We would like to know. So that is how the story develops. A child disappears. Where did he go? Did he run away from home? Was he kidnapped? What happened to that child? That is how the stories are constructed. And I'm working with that really. Also because I also think that, you know, all poets everywhere have said this in different ways. You know, people have said only two things are certain, taxes and death. And we know that, I mean, in Hindi and Urdu poetry also, people constantly talk about the fact that what is the body? It's a shell. It's mitti. We all know we are going to turn into ash or earth or whatever. So life in a way is only precious because we know death is coming. If we were all to be immortal, I don't know how much value we would place on our time here on earth. There is this urgency to life because we know that death is coming. And we don't know when it'll come, which makes everything feel even more intense and more urgent because it could happen tomorrow. Everything that has to be done now. And it makes us impatient. It makes us make mistakes sometimes, but it also gives meaning and value to our life. Everybody's life, no matter what kind of life it is, but you want to make the most of life within that little spell. I think all of us would be very calm if we knew we could live 300 years. I mean,
or not in the current city, or not.
Yeah, but you know, if you know you have 300 years, you could imagine your life elsewhere, right? you wouldn't be panicking at 30 because you would be like, tons of time. Let me just go and do 3 other PhDs. Yeah. So I think about that a lot, that time, basically, what do we have here in life? We have nothing but time. What we call life is time. It's the gift of time that's been given to us. And what we understand to be life is basically time. We spend so much money chasing this a little bit of extra time, prolonging your life. All our efforts, exercise, be healthy, this, that. We're buying time. That's all we're buying.
So I'll ask a question or two, and then maybe we can open the floor for the audience. So as mixing in time as well as with the kind of work that you've done, I think a lot of the story follows, I mean, that's what I felt, the reportage mode, where I felt these were snapshots that were provided to us in terms of sort of the shortage of time and the urgency of time being very much sort of felt within the text. And also in terms of the reportage also, because incidents weren't necessarily fully explored by one person or one narrative, and sort of recur and in fact are reported through the narrative of the other, whoever, by 2 characters, by 3 characters, and so on and so forth. So I was really also interested in this, how does your journalistic life sort of feed into your writing, whether it's this novel or the plays you've written or the poetry you write, because a lot of your poetry is also city nights, or sort of this idea of or talking about bodies or the nose, or I mean, there's so much work you do with different genres, where in ways, how does journalism sort of seep into that? Yeah.
Journalism feeds into everything, and everything also feeds into my journalism. But journalism has been absolutely crucial in my formation as a writer and in my style. I think it began fairly early. I think one thing reportage did for me, I was always interested in writing and observing. I think even when I was much younger, I was a kind of just sit back and not talk, but just watch people kind of person. But I didn't know how to see. There's watching and there's seeing. When people say people watching, they don't necessarily mean people perceiving. There's a difference. I think journalism, and not necessarily reportage as a job. My job did not require me to be perceptive or to wonder about people's lives. I mean, journalism that way can be quite harsh in a way that it just requires you to report events. This happened and this happened. We have evidence for this. We don't have evidence for this. It's fairly scientific in that sense, if one chooses to be. But I think because Mumbai as a city was so kind of intense, the experience of it, and the fact that in order to get to my reportage, in order to get to the event, I was exposed to 50 other things, which actually had a deeper psychological impact on me, I think. I still remember, for example, I was very young when I first started working while I was still in college, but that was a desk job. Then I found a city reportage job. And it required me to take trains, buses in an unfamiliar city with very little money. And really, half the time you had no clue where you were going. Like if I'm on the court beat, for example, you're always on the lookout for interesting cases that have slipped the mainstream reportage, and how you can build on it. So, okay, you find something and you say, okay, why don't I track this particular case? Why don't I track this person down? And somehow from police records or from court records, you find this address. Then you go to this address and meet this person. I remember going to meet this person who was accused of criminally, I think, assaulting his own sister. He didn't end up murdering her. She survived. So it wasn't homicide. It was attempt to homicide. But, I'm 21 or 22 years old. I'm going to meet this guy who's a potential murderer. And for me, just considering the fact that I'm having to do this, that I'm in a way choosing to do this. It took a certain amount of, I think, not just physical courage, it took moral courage to, in that moment, you have to suspend your judgment. You're going to meet this guy. He's possibly a murderer. Quite apart from what he might do to you, that's a completely separate question. You have to be respectful to him. You have to draw him out in a conversation, how you're going to do this. And I have completely forgotten that conversation. I don't know what he told me. I don't think he denied it, or he gave some justification, I don't know. But I remember that man's face. I remember his materiality, his body, the way he was sitting there in a banyan. He was an older man, much older than I imagined. He looked older than he was. This gray hair and unkempt and obviously poor also. And, you know, this is a word I didn't know then. We've now started to use this much more. Multiplicity of experiences, intersectionality, all that. I didn't know those words at the time. But I remember sitting there and coming to the conclusion that there is a way to approach a story. There's a way to understand people. And I may not be able to do it in my reportage. In my reportage, I may not be able to express that this man, while being criminal, is also something else, and that his relationship with his sister is fraught for many reasons. Reportage doesn't really have the room for you to say a lot of these things that are not said by people, but which you can sense. You know, you sense that the man may perhaps be regretting it. He's not saying he's regretting it, but something about his body language, his face, communicates a certain confusion, maybe regret, maybe not. Those were the things that fiction allows. And I think that I kind of understood that in doing this. Or other things, like I remember very early, I was lost. I'd gone to Vadala somewhere, new area. I didn't know how to get back to the station. And I stopped a man on the street to ask him, ki bhaiya kaise jaate hain? And he told me, and I started walking. And this other woman, this Marathi woman wearing that 9-yard sari, like a dhoti, this big basket of something on her head. She came up to me, she stopped me, and she said, "Why did you ask the man?" I said, she said, "Never ask men, always ask women. If you can see a woman around to ask for anything, ask the woman, don't ask the man." Now, she was looking out for me. A complete stranger. She saw this is a young girl, completely clueless, looking lost. So she stepped up. She guided me to wherever I had to go. But her concern was also rooted in fears. And what gave rise to those fears? What kind of life must she have led that she's so frightened herself, but also for me, that her experiences have taught her that even something as ordinary as just asking someone ki bhaiya, how to get to this address, is fraught with danger, because the man might lead you somewhere where you don't want to go. And he might just say that, come with me, I'll take you. And you might follow him. And who knows what will happen after that. So the city is full of these stories, and nobody tells these stories, and you know, they kind of happen and they disappear. So in a way, this book is also my way of just somehow trying to just reach out and capture something, just grab hold of these little stories and these thoughts and frame them in some way.
I'll ask my last question, even though I have a lot more, and then sort of open the floor. Interestingly, what you were just talking about also reminded me of this book called Why Loiter? Women and Risk on Mumbai Streets, in particular, by Shilpa Fatke and Samira Khan and Shilpa Ranade. And I wanted to start by, again, quoting from one of your poems. This is Inheritance 2. And it goes, a section from it: if we only knew what to blame, things become speakable. All things become speakable once they have a name, a where from, a how to, how not to, a how do I live with this song. And I find it really interesting when you're talking about the interesting incidents and the unordinary, as well as sort of how your novel plays out, or the poem that you've written, 5 newspaper reports rewritten for greater clarity, and the relationship of fiction and journalism as well. I'm also really interested in the fact that you haven't named any of your characters. And also, I mean, what most of the stories, all the 12 stories follow the everyday. So also interestingly, where I see your fiction then in the way that you're talking about it, in the way you've written in your poetry, sort of covering the left out sort of narratives, what sort of leaks out and what sort of isn't there as the visible and becomes the invisible in the city. The idea of the banal or the ordinary as the interesting, as the unordinary, as the incident, so to say, for that matter. And I think sort of it's in this ordinariness that your novel, and in this, the unnamedness of characters, that it becomes every person and sort of the city. So just a little bit about this banal and the ordinary, and what made you choose that, and the unnaming, because there's so much happening around naming things in the current society. So a little bit about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in the poem, the context of the poem, I was speaking of things that are unspeakable, and not unspeakable in a gruesome, brutal sense necessarily. Things that we cannot articulate very easily, or things for which we don't have definition. You know, there are relationships that can't be defined. There are fears and griefs that you don't quite know how to talk about, and I think that it is important to name, to talk, because that which is not articulated kind of also gets dismissed very easily. Whether it can be as small as love, you know, if you can't articulate it, it will be dismissed or ignored or just never recognized. And it can be something as serious as citizenship. If you cannot be named as a citizen, if you cannot be acknowledged and in writing be acknowledged as a citizen, it's a very dangerous place to be. So I think naming and definition is important. Naming of characters, I think it works the opposite way. I've often done this instinctively. I think I did a collection of short stories earlier called Love Stories, and at that time I was just experimenting. You know, I didn't consciously set out to name or not name. But what I find is that when I'm writing, if I don't name a character, the nature of the story changes completely. The way I'm writing and the things I'm writing about changes completely. The moment I attach a name, the story flows in a different way. Like, for example, even if I give a very neutral kind of name, you know, that's where caste and identity and whatever is not very easily attached to that character. For example, a name like Raja or Raju. Now it's kind of common to various whatever. Could be middle class, could be poor, we don't know. It's, you know. But the moment I say that, I also have to then think about, okay, so this is this guy called Raja. What's his wife's name? Because I have named Raja, I must name his wife. The moment I think of his wife's name, I have to then think also, is it going to be a neutral name? Are all my characters going to have names that are sort of possibly multi kind of drawing in multiple identities? If I don't want the name to work that hard, if I want a name to just be something ordinary, I don't know, could be anything, could be Daisy, for example, it's the name of a flower. But the moment I have given a name like Daisy, which is the name of a flower, I also have to think about people around her. What are her friends called? Is her name unusual? So my writing changes, and it starts to focus on things that are not necessarily the things I want to focus on. This is not true of all my fiction. I have written fiction that is completely rooted in name, community, sect, even, you know, where I know that this is not only for example, a Muslim character, it's a Shia Muslim character in this little small town and with these particular quirks. This is that kind of family, you know. So I can write like that too. But when I'm writing that, then I know that the act of naming is doing certain things. when I'm doing something else, when I'm doing characters, like this novel is about the city, I wanted it to be about the city. I wanted it to be about the character's relationship to the city. The act of naming would have thrown me off. It may not throw the reader off, but it would throw me off as a writer. So I don't name them. And if at the end of it, I find that the story works even without the naming, then I dispense with the naming. Sometimes I begin writing without names and later I will attach names because I feel it doesn't make a difference to the story. In this case, I felt it would make a difference.
I'll just end with one comment and you can choose to comment on it or not. And then maybe Sheba can take questions since she'll be used to sort of how the platform works. The naming, unnaming, the incident, the accident, or the very song that you start, take the name of the text from Ye Mumbai Sheher, Haadson Ka Sheher hai. So that whole, I also think it's very interesting in terms of how the novel deals with violence and spaces of violence. We've experienced a different kind of violence today in the earlier session. And how sort of, whether it's language, whether it's spaces, whether it's language can do both. It can violate. It can sort of completely violate spaces, experiences, people, identity, but it can also reclaim and sort of invisibilize, articulate, as you said. How do you think using language, because you've written in so many genres and sort of texts, how does the process of putting a genre to the language and the different conventions of these genres work when you come up with a story or come up with a poem? I mean, how do you decide, or is it just comes naturally in that moment? And with that, I'll end my questions. Yeah.
That is a complicated question. I think the thing with working in many genres is, for me, a part of it is just me flexing my creative muscles. I take this fairly seriously, that you have to exercise as a writer. And initially, I was just writing nonfiction because I worked as a journalist, and I was writing fiction because I wanted to, and little bits of poetry. And for a while I was content doing that. But I also found that there were certain stories that I wanted to tell, and I would begin telling them as prose, and I would find myself getting stuck. And yet the story would be clear in my head. Like I would be able to see those characters in my head. So how am I going to write this? I struggled for a while. Like, I knew this is not a novel, because a novel requires a certain sweep and a certain manner of telling that story. And I found that because I could hear the words, the exchanges, and I could see that thing unfolding in my head like a scene from a movie, I began to write a play. And I found that that was working. The story that I couldn't tell in story form, I could tell in play form. And I think for me, some of this is driven by how it appears. Like sometimes I'm working off an image, like it's a single image. Some of those images have turned into prose here in this novel. I go somewhere, I see something. I see this woman standing on the footboard of a train, and that image bounces off something, and I start to open that out into a story. But sometimes when I sit down to write, that image is suggesting itself to me, is attracting my attention, but is also wanting to be linked with other images. It's very instinctive. I don't always know what I'm doing. But when I put pen to paper, or when I sit at my laptop, I find that the moment I have written this image down, maybe only in 2 sentences, it immediately wants me to leap to another image. And once I do that, I find that this is turning into a poem, that this does not want to become a play or a short story. Sometimes you do work harder at it. You kind of write it down, you put it away, and you say, okay, I want to turn this into a novel. How am I going to do that? And sometimes like years pass and it doesn't turn into a novel, because you haven't been able to capture something else, the next thing, that what is the story around this? Maybe you need to research a little more, needs to become that instead. So those are things I work very instinctively. Very often I don't really know which genre I'm writing in until the writing has begun. But sometimes I do sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write a play. Like when I was trying to write my last play, Untitled One, I knew I wanted to write a play. I didn't know what play I wanted to write. I wanted to submit it to a competition, basically. So I knew I wanted to write a play. I had a couple of ideas. I started to explore those. They weren't working. Those ideas were not working. I kept writing, say, one scene and discarding it, then writing another scene and discarding it. It wasn't naturally inside me yet. Then I did this exercise. Very often people will tell you to do this in writing, that just do a speed writing exercise. Begin writing and don't worry about what the story is. So I did that, and I found that I was able to write like a scene, then another scene, and I kind of knew in the writing itself, those characters got their hooks into me. And then I knew that, okay, I know what I'm doing now. So sometimes it's just a thing of trial and error, but it is true that a lot of my work gets into, for example, the novel before this, Prelude to a Riot, I wrote it as a series of monologues, soliloquies, because initially I thought that it might be a play. But once I had written two of these, the play wasn't emerging. The play structure wasn't emerging. It was just the soliloquies that were emerging. And so I wrote a set of soliloquies, and I realized that these are actually chapters in a novel, that I'm using the device of a character standing on stage, just speaking directly to the audience in first person. But it has nothing else that is integral to drama in it. Drama has it requires something else to happen on stage. You can use the soliloquy device, but ultimately it is about dialogue. It is about action, and action that is visibly unfolding on stage. Storytelling can happen on stage, but ideally, if you're writing a play, it needs to do different things. Otherwise, you may as well write a short story or a novel. So I ended up turning that into a novel. And when I wrote my play, Untitled One, it has long passages, which are, I'm using the device of a writer writing in real time. Now, if you're talking about a writer's character who's writing, how are you going to show long passages? Right? Like the act of writing is not a dramatic act. It's a prosaic act. It's an intellectual act. So there are long passages where this writer, I'm using the device of the soliloquy to actually do the opposite, to present prose, passages of nonfiction to the audience. So sometimes I mix it up, and I think it's a good thing. Breaking convention, breaking form is integral to making the form grow. Seeing that, okay, can this happen? Can I make this work? Doesn't always work, but maybe sometimes it does work.
I promise I'll stop after this. Just one thing that came to my mind. You talked about the novel being the first draft being written in 2014 in one of your interviews. And I was just curious in terms of how did the novel finally come about when it came about now, and sort of the journey of this text in particular. And that's where I'll stop for sure. Yeah.
So a lot of the kind of real life experiences and images and objects that inspired this have been collected over a lifetime. They've been collected over 20 years. I sat down to write, I think, in 2014. I didn't know what I was writing. So initially just putting down those images on paper, creating these characters. Initially, there weren't 12. Initially, there were fewer. In 2014, I think I only wrote about maybe 8 or 10. And then I put it away for some time. Then after a year, I added, because I shared it with a friend for feedback, came back to it myself with new eyes. And I was like, okay, something is missing. What is missing? How is one story connecting to the other? Then I added the last 2 stories later, and did the work of making sure that the ends were tying up. I mean, they don't tie up very neatly, I know, but there is. If
that's the interesting part of the that's add by all means add to the experience of the text.
Yeah.
Sorry for
no, so basically just making sure that there is a hook, that in each story it does lead to the next story. That is important for it to function like a novel. So I did that work somewhere between 2015 and 16, and then I put it away. Then I had to work on Prelude too. I was working on Prelude and this side by side. So I finished Prelude, and the publisher wanted to publish Prelude first, so we did Prelude. Sometime last year, I began work again on this one. There were still little bits that needed fixing, and because it's such a short novel also, I'm working with few words, and those few words need to matter. So, really had to go over it line by line to just make each sentence matter and not to go overboard, to take away the images that are doing too much work, that are distracting the reader, to work with my editor. And, that process takes a year. So that took a lot of time. And you also have to decide, how specific are you going to be, and what are the details that you want to resist putting in too much detail, so that then it doesn't become a very large novel. But I also wanted to resist, I was resisting adding details that sometimes my editor felt that, okay, you may want to add just a little bit here. So then that process takes time for you to.
The text aging with you, I found that really interesting in terms of, because you wrote a lot in between. You've written poetry continuously, you've published other books, you've published plays, you published The Prelude, you published Bread, Cement, Cactus. So, you've constantly been working on other kinds of writing. So this aging of a text with the author, and when you go back to it, I found fascinating in terms of the process as you're talking about it as well. Yeah, thank you.
The City of Incident allowed me also to do this. It's a text that doesn't age so easily. It doesn't have, these experiences are not going to become irrelevant in any sense, because they're about people. Finally, they're about the city, but they're about the people in the city, and their negotiations and heartbreaks, and the ways in which they sometimes struggle, but sometimes just kind of surrender to their circumstances. And so I think that the slowness of the process suited this particular novel. I don't think the other things I wrote could not have waited, perhaps.
Thank you so much for your responses and sort of thinking through the process and everything. And I'll let Shiba take over in terms of the questions. But it's been wonderful talking to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I think we would end the discussion here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for being here, everyone. Thank you, Wafa and Shiba.
Yeah, and thank you for engaging to Annie, Shiba, and everyone else as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Take care.